When you see headlines from Nigeria, they're so often about violence. But behind those news alerts, there's a human crisis that's absolutely devastating. We're going to look at the staggering loss of life, the really intense debate over what's causing it, and the one thing almost everyone agrees is fueling the fire: the collapse of the state itself. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll start with the human cost, because that's what matters most. Then we'll unpack the two big competing ideas that try to explain the violence. From there, we'll see how communities are finding the strength to get through this before we finally dig into the root cause of the whole crisis. All right, first things first. To really get what's happening, you have to understand the sheer scale of the violence. This isn't just a few isolated incidents. It's a relentless, devastating wave of attacks, and the human toll is just profound. And a picture like this one from Chibok, it just brings it all home, doesn't it? These aren't just statistics we're talking about. These are homes, these are families, entire communities being torn apart, leaving behind this landscape of just loss. And then you see a number like this, and it just stops you cold. In the last reporting period, this is the number of Christians who were killed for their faith, just in Nigeria. So let's put that number into perspective, because this is where it gets truly staggering. Of all the Christians killed for their faith across the entire world, Nigeria accounts for 72% of them. It has tragically become the deadliest place on earth to be a Christian. And look, this isn't a one-off thing. The violence is relentless. This timeline just shows a few harrowing months: a mass kidnapping from a school, coordinated holiday attacks, a New Year's massacre, even after the authorities were warned, and then a brazen abduction of over 100 people right from their churches. So when you see this kind of pattern, it leads to one of the central arguments, a really tough question. Is this just random violence, or is it a calculated campaign targeting a specific faith? Well, for many, the answer is a clear yes. The Christian Association of Nigeria, or CAN, they don't mince words. Their president, Archbishop Daniel Okol, is on the record, along with many others, calling it what they believe it is: a genocide. So the people who make this argument, they point to a few key things. It really boils down to who is doing the attacking and how they're doing it. The attackers are often Islamist groups like Boko Haram or radicalized Fulani militants. And when you see them specifically targeting Sunday services or abducting entire congregations, well, it's pretty hard not to see that as a deliberate war on faith. But like with any complex crisis, there's another side to this story. A completely different take on what's driving all of this violence, arguing that its main motivation isn't actually religion. And this chart here, it just lays out the two sides of the debate perfectly. On one hand, you have the claim of genocide, driven by religious hate. And on the other, the claim of what's called generalized insecurity, driven by things like crime, land disputes, and fights over resources, where the attackers are seen more like criminals who will target anyone. And this isn't some fringe idea. This view is held by a lot of Nigerian officials and legal experts like Dr. Wahab Shidu. They argue that calling it a genocide is actually a misdiagnosis. They say it overlooks the bigger picture, which is a total collapse of security that's affecting everyone, no matter what their faith is. So the people making this argument, they'll point to evidence from all over the country, like rampant banditry in the Northwest or organized land grabs in the Middle Belt. They argue the root cause isn't about religious ideology. It's about a tangled web of criminality that just explodes when the government is weak. Okay, so you've got officials and experts debating the why. But what about the people living through this every single day? How in the world do they endure this? Well, to understand their resilience, you really have to look at the powerful spiritual beliefs that shape how they respond. For many Christians in Nigeria, suffering isn't just a meaningless tragedy. They often see it through the lens of Scripture, like this passage from the Gospel of Matthew. It actually frames persecution not just as something to endure, but as a blessed, if incredibly painful, part of a spiritual journey. And this isn't a new idea, not at all. It's a core concept in Christian theology. The Protestant reformer Martin Luther even called it the mark of the sacred cross. This idea that enduring persecution for your faith is actually a sign that your church is authentic. People also find meaning by looking back at ancient stories. What's happening with land grabs in Nigeria today? It has this incredible, tragic echo of the biblical story of Naboth's vineyard, where an innocent man was killed by a king who just wanted his land. It frames today's injustice as part of a very, very old struggle. And maybe the most powerful idea of all is this one, the refiner's fire. It's the belief that God uses these intense trials not to destroy, but to purify, to burn away the impurities and bring out a faith that's even stronger and more precious, just like gold. All right, so we have these two huge, competing narratives and this deep theology of suffering. But there's one thing, one foundational issue that pretty much everyone agrees on, and it's what makes all of this possible in the first place. Look, it almost doesn't matter what the motive is, religious hate, pure greed, you name it. None of it could happen without one thing, a catastrophic failure of the state to protect its own people. That is the bedrock of this entire crisis. So when you boil it all down, this is what you're left with. You have weak governance, the rule of law has just collapsed, and that creates a power vacuum. When there's no justice for victims and zero consequences for the people who attack them, you get a climate of impunity. And that climate is the perfect breeding ground for both targeted persecution and generalized crime to absolutely flourish. And that leaves us with the biggest question of all, the one that ties this whole tragic story together. The debate over labels and motives. It's important, but it's all happening in the shadow of a state that cannot or will not protect its citizens. So when the very foundations of law and order crumble, where does a nation even begin to look for justice?